U.S. approach to the current war with Iran marks a break with long-standing rules of military engagement, which boil down to this.
We have to try and save human lives rather than taking them away.
I'm Marco Werman. Today, what those rules are and why they exist in the first place. Also, newlyweds in Seoul, South Korea, are having trouble scrounging up money for their first apartments.
그러니까 아무래도 어쨌든 사실 결혼이 집이라는
When you're married, you can't really start your family until you find a home.
Plus, a pioneer who warned of the perils of overpopulation and his complicated legacy.
We should consider ourselves lucky to get to live in a big world. We benefit from living in a big world.
Plus, remember Songs of the Humpback Whale? We'll spin you the oldies version from Bermuda. All today, here on The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. It is good to be with you this Monday. More chaos and escalation this week in the U.S. and Israeli war on Iran. Israel is expanding its ground operations in Lebanon in an attempt to root out the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah. And President Trump is calling on U.S. allies and China to send warships to Iran to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So far, the response to Trump's request has been tepid at best, leading the president to accuse reluctant countries of being disloyal to the United States. Just the latest in a series of reminders since this war began that we are living in a new era. Many of the doctrines, rules, and norms that shaped American military strategy for decades are being tossed out the window. Take a listen to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at a Pentagon press briefing earlier this month, where he boasted that the U.S. military is unleashing the most precise and lethal air power campaign in history.
All on our terms, with maximum authorities. No stupid rules of engagement, no nation-building quagmire, no democracy-building exercise, no politically correct wars.
We begin our show today with the international rules of engagement being dismissed there and the likely consequences of ignoring them. Margaret McMillan joined me for that. She's an emeritus professor of history at the University of Oxford and a leading scholar of 20th century peacekeeping agreements. Here's how she summed up those rules.
They go back a very long way. Things like you don't hit at civilians if they're not engaged in war. Things like you treat prisoners of war correctly. A lot of them were codified, in fact, by an American during the Civil War, someone called Franz Lieber, who developed a code for President Lincoln, which has become the basis of a lot of the modern laws of war. It's an irony that the United States seems to be tossing it all out at the moment.
Well, indeed. I mean, we have to go back to the late 19th century, really, to understand why these laws and rules came into being. Why were they formulated to begin with?
Well, they were formulated in situations like the American Civil War, where the danger was that the passions were so high that all sorts of atrocities would happen. And so it was seen as protection both for those fighting and for those who were caught up in the fighting through no will of their own. Of course, they're ignored. They were ignored in the Second World War by the Germans and the Italians often. But they are, I think, a very important part of war. I mean, it's trying to make war, it sounds odd, but it's trying to make it more civilized. And perhaps it's a step to getting rid of war altogether. We used to hope so anyway.
How were they extended into the international sphere with U.S. wars abroad and also being picked up by other countries?
They began to be codified in different countries, and then there was the famous meeting in Geneva where a number of nations signed on to the Geneva Conventions, and those have been redone and updated as new weapons come along and new war crimes are formulated. And so they are part of an international structure, international law. And I think most countries in the world, including the United States, have signed on to them. And there are also the Hague Conventions about what sort of weapons you can use and when. And so it sounds odd, as I say, but it is an attempt to try and preserve something of civility and something of humanity.
I want you to go back, please, to that meeting in Geneva and why the Geneva Conventions were adopted. What was the context? What was happening?
Well, what was happening was the Industrial Revolution and the rise of nationalism, the rise of competition among powers in the 19th century. And there was, I think, a growing fear that the weapons of destruction were getting so strong that they would threaten the whole of human civilization. And so there was a tremendous attempt in the 19th century to try and deal with that. And of course, that was fueled further by the First World War, out of which we got the Americans and others coming together to try and make a League of Nations that would act collectively against aggressors. Because there was, I think, a real prospect, as we know today, that we now have such means of destruction. And that's how they certainly felt by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. We have such means of destruction that we can destroy human civilization itself. And so we have to think of ways to avoid that.
Do you think the current war with Iran suggests that the international legal framework governing the use of force has basically lost its practical meaning?
Well, it has been severely damaged because it is being ignored. And it was ignored, of course, by Russia when it attacked Ukraine and took Crimea, and when it attacked Ukraine again and has seized large chunks of Ukrainian territory. I mean, one of the laws of war is that seizing territory by force will not be recognized by the international community. And that's pretty much been in effect since 1945. And that, of course, now seems to be going by the by. We've also, I think, seen treatment of prisoners which have not matched or not lived up to the rules of war. I mean, the sad thing is that the laws of war actually benefit both sides. You know, sooner or later, Americans, for example, will be taken prisoner. And it would be in the interest of the United States and those prisoners that they be treated according to the Geneva Conventions.
Do you think this marked shift in how international law is being ignored, is it really that new? I mean, haven't powerful nations historically, for the most part, used international law as kind of a legal gloss for their exploits?
That has often happened, and it has helped to undermine faith in international law. You could argue that the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which the coalition carried out, really tended to make international law look rather useless. But I think the fact that we have it is a way of holding up nations and their leaders to criticism, holding them up perhaps eventually to punishment. I mean, we have seen cases where those who have broken the laws of war have in fact been tried. Slobodan Milosevic of Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic in Bosnia have been tried at The Hague, and they have been blamed for what they did. And so I think it remains an aspiration. It's not always going to work, but I think we're better off with some form of international law and hope that international law can work than not having it at all, because then we just go back to power makes right, and the powerful will do whatever they want.
So you mentioned the conditions in the late 19th century and turn of the 20th century that led the U.S. and other nations to formulate rules of war. Can you just say a bit more about what changed with the Geneva Conventions of 1949?
Well, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 simply expanded and made more explicit a lot of what had been understood before. And again, I think we have collectively sometimes managed, not always, we have managed to hold nations to accountability. And we have sometimes managed to prevent worse things happening. I mean, Slobodan Milosevic was planning to expel all the Albanians from Kosovo, and he had already started to do it. And collectively, we managed to stop that. And a number of the Albanians were able to come back to what was their homeland. And so I think we have to keep trying. The alternatives, I think, are too terrifying. And of course, we have much stronger weapons now than we've ever had before. I mean, our capacity to destroy civilization globally is now huge.
I'm speaking with Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Oxford, Margaret Macmillan, about the war in Iran, rules of engagement, and international law. So when it comes to accountability, when rules are not followed, what happened in My Lai?
Well, the rules were not followed. It was an unprovoked attack by an American Army patrol on a village from which there had been, I believe, shots fired at American forces. But it was a village with ordinary people in it, no evidence that there were Viet Minh there. And there was simply a massacre. It was a classic example of the military running out of control. I mean, they're trained to kill, but they're trained to do it in a disciplined way. And unfortunately, the discipline broke. And there wasn't full punishment for everyone involved, but it was made public. It did lead to a great deal of soul searching in the United States, a great deal of discussion about what is happening to our children, what is happening to us. I mean, the mothers of one of the soldiers involved said, "I sent you my son, he was a good boy, and you sent me back a murderer." And I think that really mattered. And I think one person was held accountable, but a number of names came out. And I think those who were involved had to live with the shame of it. I think it was an important moment, and it was a very good example of what can happen when military discipline breaks down.
Has that moment been forgotten, you think?
I hope it hasn't. It certainly wasn't forgotten by the American military. I mean, the American military take very seriously the laws of war because they're dealing with the issues raised by them the whole time. And there was a full-scale overhaul, examination within the Pentagon and within the military after My Lai to try and prevent something like that happening again. I mean, I think the military themselves felt a sense of shame that it had happened.
Today, though, how optimistic are you that accountability for any violations of rules of war are going to happen at the same time that we're talking about how rules of engagement are being ignored?
Well, we do have to worry about that. And it seems to me that the statements of Secretary of Defense Hegseth are not what you would expect from a Secretary of Defense. And none of his predecessors, I think, would have talked like that. Power is not the only thing that matters in war. And just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. You know, we can get into the moral arguments, but I think there's also a very practical argument here. And that is, if you break those rules, you're asking for trouble for your own soldiers. And I think that's important. And I think it's important that civilians are protected, that civilians don't ask to be caught up in a war. They sometimes find themselves in the middle of a battlefield or at the receiving end of an attack. And I think it is important that civilians be protected because one day it's going to be your civilians that are going to need to be protected, even if you are the great power. One day your civilians are going to be in that position. And I think you want to do what you can to protect them.
Secretary Hegseth referred to so-called international institutions, but these institutions were organized by parties, including the U.S. So how does the globe get back to the relevance of international law as it was first conceived?
We tend to get back to the relevance after a catastrophe, and that's part of the trouble. You know, it takes sometimes something awful to happen, and I don't think we want the world to get any more trouble than it is at the moment. But sometimes events make us realize that, in fact, we need to think of other ways of settling disputes than going to war. And again, just to go back to something I said earlier, I mean, the weapons at the disposal now of the powers, and not so great powers, including North Korea, are absolutely terrifying. I mean, you know, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which destroyed a whole city, was tiny by comparison with what's in the arsenals of some of the nuclear powers today. And so we can't risk a major war. And I think we need, even more than before perhaps, to find ways of avoiding war. And that's what the League of Nations at the end of the First World War, which was very much pushed by the United States and President Woodrow Wilson, and that's what the United Nations, again, very much pushed by the United States, and this time the United States joined, which it didn't for various reasons, with the League of Nations. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt really thought that it was important because he understood what war would cost. He'd lived through the First World War. He'd seen the devastation of the Second World War. And there was a lot of support for this around the world, that we have to find another way of settling disputes than going to war. And the idea was that these new institutions would provide collective security so that if an aggressor nation attacked one of their members, collectively they would deal with it. Now, that hasn't always worked very well, as we know. But I think the idea is a good one. And just because something doesn't work doesn't mean the idea is not good. And as I say, I don't think we have much choice now but to try and avoid war and avoid a war that will spread into a major confrontation between nuclear armed powers.
And yet there seem to be actors on this planet who desperately want to go to war. So if the Holocaust led to the Geneva Conventions, millions of dead people across the globe, does that tell us that something equally bad or even worse has to happen to get us back on track with international law?
Well, I for sure hope it doesn't mean that, because the even worse, I think, is catastrophic. I mean, you know, we had a global war, particularly in the Second World War, and the damage done by weapons then was absolutely enormous. I mean, the damage that could be done today, I think, is absolutely horrific. And of course, we're not just destroying people, we're destroying infrastructure, we're destroying the environment. Already what's happening in Iran with the enormous fires that are going on is polluting the air and may have long-term consequences. And so I think we're really in a very dangerous situation. And I only hope that the powers of the world will sort of step back and say, look, we don't want to go into a major war. The trouble is when you start a conflict, you never know where it's going to end. And when great powers get involved, then it gets more dangerous. I mean, we may look back in 20 years and say, well, thank goodness we dodged something there, and people may have forgotten that it happened. And students may say, what, was there a war in the Middle East? But we may look back and say, we should have known better.
Margaret Macmillan is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Oxford and author of Peacemakers, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and its attempt to end war. Margaret, thank you very much for walking us through this history of rules of engagement. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Pleasure to speak to you. Have a good day.
Just ahead, the rental market in Seoul, South Korea, and why the government there is trying to help young couples especially pay for homes. You're with The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. It is a problem in many major cities around the world. Rent is too high, and buying a place that has become increasingly out of reach. Here's the basic analysis. For the last decade, people's incomes have not kept pace with the rising cost of housing. That's true globally. This week, we're zooming in on the housing picture in 4 cities on 4 continents. Today, we go to Seoul, South Korea, where young couples moving into their first homes often start with what's known as a jeonse. A tenant puts down a huge sum of money, more like a deposit, but bigger, and then they live rent-free. When they move out, they get the entire amount back. For generations, it was seen as an affordable way for newlyweds to get their start, but not anymore. Jason Struther in Seoul has our story.
안녕하세요. 제이슨입니다. 반갑습니다.
I'm headed up to the home of a couple in their 30s. By the numbers, it's a 3-room apartment on the 6th floor of a 22-story building.
그런 리빙룸, 다이닝룸이고요. 여기는 저희 굉장히
Haein, who asked just to go by her first name, shows me around. She lives here with her husband. They moved in just over a year ago. She says it's not their dream home, but it checked their boxes.
사실 이 집에 대해서 뭔가 막 너무 마음에 들어서 왔다기보다는
We needed to find an apartment that was in our budget, she says. It was close to public transportation, and it didn't need any remodeling.
신랑 신부 내빈께 인사.
Haein is a content creator who chronicled her wedding journey, including apartment hunt, on her social media channels. Along the way, she learned a lot about Seoul's pricey housing market. Most Korean couples want to live in new, high-rise apartment buildings. The way they afforded that in the past was with a jeonse. These deposits on rentals have always been a big investment. Usually, couples would come out of their wedding with a jeonse, gifted by family. A jeonse used to be roughly 50% of a home's value, but price tags on these apartments have risen dramatically. In the last year alone, home values rose 13.5%. So along with that in recent decades, deposits for really nice apartments in Seoul have gone from something in the neighborhood of a couple $100,000 to several $100,000. In really well-to-do areas, you could easily pay close to $1 million. On top of that, every 2 years, tenants have to renew their contracts, and landlords take that opportunity to hike the price and increase the deposit. For some, that arrangement is out of reach. For others, it no longer makes financial sense. Haein and her husband didn't want to put down that kind of money for a jeonse. They'd need to take out a loan, in which case, why not buy a place? So Haein says they put off finding their forever home for a little longer and also starting a family.
저희도 자녀를 가질 계획이 당연히 있는데 집 문제가 해결이 돼야 뭔가
She says they
계획을 세울
want
수
to
있을
have a
것 같아요.
child,
지금
but need to
저희가
find a more
12월에
permanent home
만기고
first. They'd like to buy an apartment, but want to do it soon before prices go up any higher. This is a common scenario. Kim Jin-yu is a housing policy professor at Kyunggi University.
아주 직접적으로 영향을 미치죠. 일단은 주거가 불안정한 상태에서
He says
결혼하는
there's a direct link between housing affordability and the country's low birth rate. Kim explains that because couples feel unstable in the real estate market, they're putting off marriage as well as having kids. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, South Korea is the only wealthy nation with a fertility rate below 1.0. More people die than are born here each year. The South Korean government has called this a national emergency, and that's prompted authorities to try something new to tackle the housing affordability crisis. Seoul has expanded programs for subsidized housing that includes funding for apartments as well as low-interest loans for deposits. Ho Jungwon, a Seoul housing official, says the goal is to encourage couples to marry and have children.
인구가 줄어들게 되면은 도시의 활력이 줄어드는 부분이 큰 것 같습니다.
He explains that it's unsustainable for a society if the population continues to decrease. Eventually, there won't be enough young people to work and support the elderly. Plus, just fewer young people makes a city less vibrant. The new housing programs could be making a difference. That's 2-month-old Kim Do-ah. Her father, Kim Jung-hak, and mother, Im Yuna, sent me this video. They married last year and received a low-interest jeonse loan. I gave them a call after Do-ah fell asleep.
그러니까 아무래도 어쨌든 사실 결혼이 집이라는
When you're married, you can't really start your family until you find a home, Kim says.
그 대출이 되게 많은데 저희가 그 행복주택이나 이런 나라에서
Im adds
지원해주는
they applied
집들이
for some
있는데
other affordable
그럴
housing
때
programs,
뭐
but they were very
대출 이런 게
competitive, so
많아가지고
they didn't get
여기
selected.
있는
But
사람들은
now
그렇지
they're
않아도
eligible for
선호하고
loans
그런
meant
거를 많이
specifically
선택하는
for
편이에요.
couples who just had a baby, and if they get that, they'll move to a bigger place. For the second year in a row, the birth rate in Korea has inched up. That's according to a new government report. But housing prices are rising much faster. For The World, Jason Struther, Seoul.
We have some oceanic news to share with you. It has to do with a sound recorded in 1949.
Date 7th March 1949.
But only recently discovered. That's a humpback whale, but more significantly, it's the oldest known recording of the species and its song. In 1949, the people making that recording on a U.S. Navy research vessel off the coast of Bermuda did not know what they were hearing. It hadn't even been discovered that whales have a song. That would take another 20 years. The researchers were just trying to learn the basic science of how sound travels underwater.
They were hearing sounds they were not expecting. And they were curious. And so they kept this recorder running.
That's Ashley Jester at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute on Cape Cod, speaking to the Associated Press. She directs Woods Hole's Research and Data Library, where the recording has been part of a collection this entire time. Jester told our colleagues at CAI in Woods Hole that the descriptions of the contents of this audio caught her attention.
It said things like fish noises and whoop whoop fish. And that made me think there was probably something interesting on that recording, but we didn't know what it was.
Senior research specialist Layla Sayegh spoke to CAI as well.
It's pretty great. I mean, the sounds are clear and analyzable.
Sayegh explained how this discovery might open up new opportunities for scientists observing ocean life today.
It shows what the soundscape was like, a long time ago and could potentially be compared to recordings in the same area today to get a sense of how much background noise has increased.
Noise made by humans impacts sea life in all kinds of ways, which scientists are currently trying to better understand. Science aside, it's also just cool to hear whales singing more than 75 years ago. Amazing bit of time and space. A whale off the coast of Bermuda in 1949. Let that sink in. You're with The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. In 1968, biologist Paul Ehrlich made a provocative prediction. The number of people in the world was growing too quickly, and that growth, he said, would outpace food production, causing widespread famine and environmental collapse. This was the argument at the center of Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb. Ehrlich died last week at the age of 93. Michael Giarrusso is co-author of After the Spike, which assesses the problem of depopulation. He told me that despite being wrong, Ehrlich's ideas have had a lasting influence.
Ehrlich warned that if we didn't get the population under control, that we were going to starve ourselves to death. And that thinking, which wasn't just from Ehrlich, influenced generations of policymakers and the general public in ways that ultimately led to some pretty coercive policies around the world. So these ideas found homes in India and China, where there was coercive reproductive policy, forced sterilizations, forced abortions. And in the U.S., foreign aid policy was conditioned in some cases on the receiving country implementing population control.
Is it clear that those responses from different nations were a function of what Ehrlich was predicting?
I think you can trace a very clear line between the zero population growth movement and the sort of anti-human population control movement and the political currents that led to actual population control policies around the world. I don't know that it was Ehrlich in particular as opposed to his group of contemporaries along with him, but he was certainly a leader in this movement.
So parts of the globe took his predictions very seriously, changed policy with negative consequences in some cases. In the general public, how were his predictions received at the time?
Well, for decades, many of us have heard about the worry of overpopulation. These ideas have endured for decades and decades and decades, even as they've been proven wrong over and over and over again. So take food production, for example. That's where Ehrlich focused in his work. In every decade since his 1968 book came out, on every continent, we've grown more and better calories. And in fact, we've done such a good job of growing more and better calories that calorie availability per person on every continent has been increasing decade after decade, even as the population has been increasing.
The fundamental idea, though, that population is growing and it continues to grow, and that is struggling against what is needed for everyone to have a decent life on planet Earth. Doesn't that kind of idea still hold?
It sure does. I think part of what made Ehrlich's views so appealing is that at its core, zero-sum thinking is an attractive idea. That's the idea that there's only so much to go around, so that if someone else is benefiting, it must mean that I'm harmed. In Ehrlich's work, that meant that more people on the planet would mean less food for each of us. Today, those intuitions have proven highly appealing and sticky, but they're just completely at odds with the history and evidence about population and prosperity.
So at the center of this is the structure of the global population. What are the current trends of global populations?
So even at the time that Ehrlich was writing, birth rates had been falling for decades, and they've been falling since. And so today, fertility rates are quite low in most of the world. So today, 2/3 of people in the world live in a country with fewer than 2 children in the next generation to replace 2 adults in the prior generation. So that's the total fertility rate. There are just really is one large region of the world where birth rates are still substantially above the 2-for-2 replacement level. That's sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why major population projections like the United Nations World Population Prospects project that within a few decades from today, the global population will peak and then begin declining decade after decade.
Yeah, so what is the calendar for that? Because I'm still trying to understand how what you were just telling us plays against the growing global population, which is now closing in on 8 billion people, right?
Yeah, so the sort of surprising thing here is that most of the population growth that has happened over the past century was not because birth rates are rising, they were falling. It was because deaths were falling. Because infant mortality in particular had been falling so fast, that's what made us climb up to this huge population size over the past century.
So it's the decline of global populations that you see as the wider trend.
Yes, and not just me. I want to be clear that basically every major institution that makes population projections sees that we are on a path now to global depopulation within this century.
Is that a problem or is that a good thing?
Well, Ehrlich would have thought it was a good thing, but I think that we should think of it as a problem. I think many times we fall into the trap of seeing other people on the planet as competition. But in the grandest picture, other people are a source of abundance, not a source of scarcity.
I'm curious, Mike, how Ehrlich's views in the population bomb influenced your own work, or maybe it provided a platform for you to start disproving it.
Yeah, I think like many people, I just sort of took for granted as a child and as a young adult that more people meant less for each. And it wasn't until I studied economics and demography that I really understood just how wrong that was. I think in some ways, my book, After the Spike, Population Progress and the Case for People, is meant to be a corrective to Paul Ehrlich's work. I would like to live in a world where, my kid doesn't grow up in school learning that other people are bad for one another, but rather that other people are a source of abundance and value for each of us.
Michael Giarrusso at UT Austin is co-author of the book After the Spike, which takes a different approach to global population trends. As we've been reporting, the war in Iran is creating fuel disruptions across the globe. People in Serbia had already been living through a tough winter thanks to an energy crisis rooted in the country's struggle to balance alliances between the West and the Kremlin. Serbia's national oil company has been under U.S. sanctions because of its majority Russian ownership. And despite the stereotype of the close relationship between Belgrade and Moscow, Russia does not appear to be in a hurry to solve the problem. Now it looks like neighboring Hungary may step in with a resolution, but the bigger question is whether there's been lasting damage to the relationship between Serbia and Russia, as we hear from Inside Europe's Guy Delaunay.
Serbia's fuel stations are dominated by Russian-owned companies, and that includes this one, run by NIS. It's Serbia's national oil company, biggest fuel retailer and operator of the country's only refineries, and it provides 4/5 of Serbia's gasoline and diesel. But its majority owners are Russian, and that means NIS is now under US sanctions.
I will say that the situation is quite serious.
Željko Markovic is a Belgrade-based energy sector consultant.
When we talk about the fuels, we are importing maybe 20%. Everything rest comes from refinery of NIS. When refinery is not working, we don't have logistic channels and don't have that business developed for the import, so we will facing the problems with the supplying of these products. So something needs to be done.
You've had the war in Ukraine since 2022 and
Yes.
sanctions being placed on Russia. Hasn't Serbia had fair warning that it needed to do something about this?
I agree with you. We had warnings and practically it's no matter who is the owner. I think that the state needs to be the owner of the energy assets. So we should be as more as we can independent for the oil, for the gas.
But NIS is neither independent nor owned by the Serbian state. Russia's giant Gazprom group holds more than half its shares, and because of the war in Ukraine, it's subject to US sanctions. Serbia had managed to persuade Washington to give NIS an exemption, but in October, the sanctions finally came into force. Ever since, the government's been scrambling to find a solution, with little sign that Moscow appreciates the urgency of the situation, and that's been exasperating for Serbia's government.
We know that NIS is not crucial for the Russia's energy sector and contributing significantly to any income of the Russian government. However, for Serbia is very important.
Dubravka Đedović-Handanović is Serbia's energy minister.
We need to see what can be alternatives for Serbia, not refusing that we would like to continue cooperating with Russian partners that have, as I said, proven to be reliable partners, but to have options simply because of the energy security and security of supply, which we need to build and create conditions for in the years to come. And this is simply to protect Serbia's citizens.
In Serbia, filling up at the pump has become a diplomatic issue. The root of the problem goes back almost 2 decades, when Serbia sold Gazprom a majority stake in NIS. Belgrade made that deal to make sure that Kosovo would be blocked from membership of the United Nations.
This was intricately tied in to Kosovo's declaration of independence, and Serbia needed to get Russia on board.
James Kerr-Lindsay is an analyst specialising in international conflict and the Balkans.
I think Putin's been sort of quite clever in how he tries and deals with Serbia. And, you know, there are enough Serbs who do have this belief in Russia as their great saviour. But I think at senior levels, they understand that, you know, it's a very transactional relationship and often very exploitative relationship as well.
Is there any chance that all of this might serve as a wake-up call to the people of Serbia who over-romanticise the relationship?
One would like to think so, but Russia is very, very good at exploiting these situations until politicians turn around and start making the case to people. And one of the big changes we've seen here in Cyprus, we've seen in Greece, is that politicians woke up to realise that Russia is not their friend. And more people can see the benefits of actually European integration and working with partners and friends and not viewing them as these traditional enemies, which I think Russia is very keen on exploiting in many ways through hybrid activities. I haven't seen any movement on that in Serbia. And I think that that's in many ways the great failing of the government, that they haven't seized this opportunity.
In fact, it now looks like neighbouring Hungary might be the key to lifting US sanctions on NIS. Their oil company MOL has made an offer to buy Gazprom's stake, but that might not spell the end of Russian leverage over Serbia. Hungary gets its oil from Russia and has friendly relations with Moscow. What's more, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov didn't appear disappointed with the impending sale of Gazprom's majority shareholding.
Regarding Serbia's oil industry, if the agreement had been disadvantageous to the Russian side, including Gazprom, it would not have been reached. This is perfectly clear to everyone. And in the current situation in Serbia, the agreement is mutually beneficial.
There'd certainly be some short-term benefits to Serbia if Gazprom completed the sale of its stake in Nice to the Hungarian company. If nothing else, it should lift the US sanctions. But perhaps this crisis will encourage the country's leaders to consider the long-term future of the East-West balancing act. After the way Moscow's behaved, Serbia might start to view its friendship with Russia as one that's running out of road. Guy Delorme, Belgrade.
That story comes to us from our partners at the DW program Inside Europe. There are plans in Madrid for a couple of really big statues. Backers have actively been looking for sites and funding, but the plans for the projects have also been pretty controversial. On the flip side, there's been in place in Madrid for a few years now the very uncontroversial statue of Paco the dog, a friend to royals, a foe of bulls, and possibly the most beloved scamp ever to call the streets of Madrid home. The World's Jerry Haddon brings us his story from the Spanish capital.
Those two megaprojects, one's an iron bull that'd be taller than the Eiffel Tower, the other a towering figure of Christ.
Vamos a levantar el Sagrado Corazón de Jesús más grande del mundo.
We're going to build the tallest Christ ever, goes a promotional video, over 110 feet tall, and you can go inside him and behold a golden heart more than 10 feet tall. God and beast, these two statues share two things in common. They're meant to attract tourists and to be colossal. Paco, though, has stayed true to life, at least in size. At first glance, you might mistake the bronze figure for real. He's painted black with a white chest. Paco's just sitting there, as if waiting for someone in a shop.
Se le ve su aspecto simpático, listo.
He has a friendly and sly face, says historian Santiago Gomez, befitting of a street dog. And he's where he belongs, Gomez says. This is his turf. That turf being a tiny park in Madrid where I meet Gomez. Paco the dog's story starts in the late 1870s, when Madrid was a hotbed of art and ideas. There were literary salons, cafes bustling with aristocrats and artists. One fine evening, a dog with no name wandered into the thick of it.
Se cruzó en el camino de un noble, el Marqués de Bogaraya.
The story goes that this stray dog crossed paths with a nobleman, Gomez says, a Marqués, who was out carousing with friends. The dog, looking for scraps, apparently made the Marqués laugh by rolling over or performing some other dog trick, he says. For his efforts, the dog got some grilled meat, his name, Paco, and, the legend goes, glory. Paco soon became a regular at the toniest joints in town. Gomez says his canine tastes, till then focused mostly on leftovers, became refined.
Se va ilustrando, se ve que se le va pegando algo de escuchar las tertulias de
He began dropping in on the debates among the intelligentsia, to go to the theater, even the Royal Opera, Gomez says. He became quite bohemian, but since he was by nature from the streets, he was also drawn to the horses and to bullfights. Now, if all this sounds fanciful, well, it is, but there are press clippings from the time documenting Paco's existence. For example, his antics in the bull ring. At times he'd jump in to harass the bulls, journalists wrote, leaping and running between the animal's legs. And there's further evidence. This composition, the anonymous sheet music archived in Spain's Ministry of Culture, is entitled Paco the Dog's Humorous Polka, arranged for and put to the keys by the world's own Michaela Varela.
Bueno, porque al final estas historias que mezclan, ¿no? La realidad, la leyenda.
Look, says Gomez, in the end, stories like this combine reality with legend. 150 years after the fact, he says, nothing's certain. The edges of Paco's stories have become blurred, as has over time his place in Madrid's collective memory. A colleague of mine, Lucas Lauerson, went down to Paco's Plaza to ask what locals know. I think Paco was a literary character from some books as a mom named Berta who's in the park with her son. All I know, says a young dad named Tony, is that he was from this neighborhood, he was very sweet, and people fed him. A story half remembered but kept alive by the little statue and a plaque with his name. Historian Gomez says that's what the bronze is all about.
¿Para qué vamos a querer figuras mastodónticas, grandes?
Why erect some enormous figure, say, of a giant bull or a god, he says, when you can have something much more humble and charming? As for Paco himself, his own sense of grandeur may have been his downfall. One day at the bullfights, the story goes, he jumped in the ring, causing the matador to trip and fall. The crowd roared with laughter. The humiliated bullfighter ran Paco through with his sword. Thus ended his life. Thus began the legend. For The World, I'm Jerry Haddon, Madrid.
You're listening to The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. All too often, we bring you stories of war and escalating violence in many parts of the globe. This is different. It's a story of what happened to one man when he was forced to put down his gun. His name is Praveen Sahai. Originally from India, Sahai takes us back to 1994 when he was a UN peacekeeper in Mozambique. He recounted his experience for the GBH program, Stories from the Stage.
I'm 14 when I learned to shoot a rifle. Guns in India are very rare because people are not allowed to buy them. But I'm part of this National Cadet Corps, and they have these old, heavy rifles from the Second World War, which are nearly as tall as I am at the time. Nevertheless, I learned to shoot that rifle, and I become a fairly good marksman, which then allows me to participate in state competitions and represent my local shooting club. Rifle shooting for me is nothing but a sport at the time in which I'm good at. So it is not an accident that 10 years later, when I finished my master's in nuclear physics, that I decided to become a pistol-carrying assistant commandant in the armed police of India. I lead hundreds of armed troops into areas affected by violence, and we are mostly using our batons rather than guns to deal with the crowds, but nevertheless, the guns have become an important tool of the trade. And I also take pride in the fact that they give me a sense of power as well as a sense of invincibility. Life takes a more interesting turn when I'm deployed to work with the United Nations Peace Mission in Mozambique in Africa. There are 30 nations or so that have contributed and committed their troops, and I'm one of the 75 police officers from India to go to Mozambique. The country has been wrecked by 15 years of militia violence. The war has killed 1 million people and caused millions more to flee to the neighboring countries. Outside of the capital city of Maputo, every building has been bombed. In the early 90s, this land is known as the most heavily mined country in the world. I'm talking about landmines, not diamond mines. It is a surprise, therefore, when I reach there that I'm told that as a peacekeeper, I'm not allowed to carry any weapons. Given how dangerous the place is, that seems like lunacy. My role as a national elections coordinator means that I'm not only supporting policy and administration from the headquarters, but I'm also building technology tools and providing training in the field. So I'm traveling a lot. I'm even more worried because my adventurous wife has now joined me with our 1-year-old son, and our apartment has already been burgled twice. So I seriously consider quitting, but the stakes are too high. I truly believe in this mission, which is going to liberate 15 million people from repeated cycles of violence and poverty. So I start to learn new behaviors, and so that I can teach myself on how to approach strangers with humility and ask simple questions such as, Hola, MK posso ajudar? Hello, how can I help you today? A month later, I'm 1,000 kilometers north near a town called Beira. After finishing work, I and my colleague are walking down a dirt street to buy some local food. It's already getting dark. And as we turn around a corner, we are suddenly face to face with about 10 people in military gear. They quickly surround us. My hands instinctively go to my hip, but of course there is no gun. My brain leaps into this alien zone where I feel no emotion, no fear, no anger. And in a voice devoid of any emotion, in a plain tone, I ask the question, what can I do to help? And I repeat that question again and again because they're not responding, they're simply glaring down at us. I think about my own mugging 2 months ago by half a dozen people armed with guns and knives in broad daylight. I'm also thinking about all of the reports of lootings and abductions of my colleagues. But I do know that all of the abducted colleagues have come back safely after we have shipped additional foods and supplies. Maybe this is all they want, some food. Despite their grubby and mercenary appearance, their eyes do not convey any violence or anger. In the meantime, this human ring has started to move. And we are getting shoved along, and I feel the pressure of hands and bodies against me, and I'm frustrated that I have absolutely no ability to defend myself. And now they're arguing about something. They're shouting at each other, the voices are rising, and I'm afraid that any moment guns are going to come out. And then suddenly, without warning, they stop. They push us back, they turn around, and they disappear in the darkness. My brain takes a moment to unfreeze and come back to reality, and for the first time, I'm aware of the deep terror. There is also the sense of relief at being alive and free. I look at my colleague, and without a word, we start walking back. Our work continues for another 6 months. The lootings and the abductions come down because the locals begin to realize that they don't need any violent posturings from us. If they need any help, they can simply come up and ask. In the month of October of '94, Mozambique holds its first ever elections. An unprecedented 93% of the citizens turn out to vote. The voting actually carries on for 3 days. The United Nations declares it a big success. For us, it has been a gratifying experience and even a majestic one at times. But it all started by removing guns from the hands of the people and removing guns from my hands. After that day, I have never picked up a gun, never have felt the need to do so. Instead, I use my experience with words and compassion to connect with people to do everything I do.
That's Praveen Sahai, who shared his experience of being a UN peacekeeper in Mozambique with GBH's Stories from the Stage. The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. Find us online anytime at theworld.org. I'm Marco Werman. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.